Hello, everyone. Welcome to MIF++ seminar. It's a great pleasure to introduce Shannon Bernier, who will talk about a crystallographic metric for continuous quantification of unit cell deformation. So based at Johns Hopkins University, Department of Chemistry. Over to you, Shannon, please.
Thanks again for the invitation to speak here today. I think I speak for all of the authors, especially those of us who are here today, that we're very excited to talk about our work in progress. The paper that we're talking about today, the working title is, as you see on the screen, a crystallographic metric for continuous quantification of unit cell deformation. The actual metric that we're talking about, we've named the cubic deviation metric, but both of those titles are sort of works in progress. So after you hear what our goals are, if you have any suggestions for better names, we'd be all ears. Please also, if you're listening in and you have a question, feel free to interrupt at any time by unmuting yourself, and I or the other authors who are here today would be more than happy to answer it. So speaking of the other authors, this is us. Tyrell McQueen is the principal investigator for this project. He has a triple appointment in chemistry, physics, and material science at Johns Hopkins University. We're on the East Coast of the US, right in the middle in Baltimore, Maryland. In the McQueen lab, myself and Greg Basson are two graduate students. Davor Tolj is a postdoctoral researcher, and Quentin Simmons was a visiting undergraduate researcher. And we were all involved in various parts of the crystallographic conceptualization and the actual synthesis of materials that we discuss in our paper. External to Johns Hopkins, we're indebted to Matthew Brem. He helped us with the proofs that our metric was going to do all the things that we needed it to do. And then we're also indebted to our funding sources, which are ultimately the US National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy. But more directly, we're funded through a combination of the Co-Design Center for Quantum Advantage, which is a group that tries to bring quantum materials, quantum computing, and quantum information people together. And then also Paradigm, which is a network of user facilities in the US that are dedicated to pushing the boundaries of materials growth, both in terms of making new materials and developing new ways to make materials. So in the McQueen lab, we like to talk a lot about the materials life cycle, and we work on various pieces of this process. It's a truly cyclical process where, say you wanted to develop better insulation for a space shuttle, you would identify the properties of the material that you needed, you'd make new materials, you'd check to see whether it was good enough for your purposes, you'd try to describe why it was or why it wasn't, use that to inform perhaps another iteration around the cycle, and make your material iteratively better and better until eventually you got one that was good enough for your purposes. But you can also enter this life cycle at any point in the process. So where we're really working today is in the model development side. We've identified a deficiency in the way that people speak about materials, and we're trying to correct that. And we're hoping and making the argument in our paper that this can help us design new materials better, as well as interpret pre-existing data better. So the real motivation for our work is this phrase, pseudo-cubic. It does not have a rigorous definition, so it's not really like a real word, but it does get used a lot in our field. And the problem with that is that it gets used by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, and it means different things depending on the context of the material. So if, say, a pseudo-cubic transition is important to one small subset of material science, it may not have the same relevance to another one, even if the properties or the consequences of that transition are similar. This is probably best illustrated with this example here. If you compare a reference cube, the red shape in the center, to the other two, cubes, by definition, have the same external side lengths and the same internal angles. But if I were to ask you which of the two other shapes is more cubic, it's not quite as straightforward, because the one on the left has the same internal angles, all 90 degrees, but the one on the right has the same side lengths. You can imagine if the ratio of the side lengths on the left-hand shape got closer and closer together, say 1 to 1 to 1.1, that becomes very, very nearly a cube, and perhaps to some experimental resolution might actually be a true cubic shape. It gets more complicated, obviously, when both the angles and the side lengths change as in a real system, and this is basically the origin of why people use the term pseudo-cubic or almost a cube in a fuzzy set of ways. Before I talk about our proposed solution to the problem, I also want to motivate this from the material science standpoint by looking at a real crystal structure. This is a crystal structure that we would call a cubic one. This is a structure of calcium, copper, manganese oxide, and I've represented it as you would in an introductory chemistry class with spheres for the atoms and lines indicating bonds between them. The black line here indicates the unit cell, which is an imaginary box that you can draw around atoms in a real crystal, that if you repeated the box and its contents infinitely, you'd make up the macroscopic crystal. So this is in the shape of a cube, and that is why we call it a cubic crystal, even though the contents don't look particularly cubic by themselves. Now, if I were looking at specifically a manganese atom here and the oxygen atoms that are bound to it, and I wanted to know if all of those oxygen atoms are in the same types of environments, in other words, if they're the same distance away from the central atom, it's not quite so easy to see in this particular picture. And so we frequently also use this representation, which is the coordination polyhedron representation. These are polyhedra that are drawn around a central atom, and the vertices are the locations of the atoms that are bound to that central atom. So using this, it's very easy to visually see that all of the oxygens are the same distance apart because the polyhedron is really symmetrical. And I bring this up in part because our method is very, very similar to previous ones where people have really carefully analyzed these coordination polyhedra, but we're actually focused a little bit more on the unit cell, as I'll mention more in a bit. But for now, the reason we might care about how far apart these all oxygens are is if there were a reason to expect that one of them were going to leave the structure when we reduced it. We knew it was going to happen to one of the manganeses, but we didn't know which oxygen it would be. When they're all symmetrical like this, they all have the same electrostatic interaction, and there's no real reason why it ought to be one versus the other. But if I go through a quote-unquote pseudo-cubic transition, and I make this a nearly cubic, but not quite cubic shape, by stretching it along one axis, now what we call apical oxygens, the ones at the top and the bottom of the tetrahedron, are further away. They have a weaker electrostatic interaction with the central atom, and therefore it's most likely that one of those is going to be the ones to go. So this is why pseudocubic transitions can be important. It's why the word can have really important meanings, but as I've mentioned, it's not rigorously defined. So we want to basically take all of the ways of packing atoms into unit cells, as opposed to looking at specifically the polyhedra within them and the small bonding environments, but rather the global structure of your crystal. And we want to put them on a kind of number line or a continuum. And this is where the word continuous originally came from in our title. We want to say that cubes are on one side, and then as you move closer towards a monoclinic shape, you are moving away from the cubic ideal, basically. This involves sorting all of the crystal classes. These images here are of the 14 Bravais lattices, which are the 14 ways of packing atoms in space in 3D. And they fall into 7 different boxes. And so frequently people will talk about something that's a cube, or they'll talk about something that's hexagonal, or they'll talk about something that's rhombohedral as separate and related, but not continuously related boxes, when in fact, these are all different categories of parallel pipettes, basically. The atoms in different places, but just this simple mathematical shape is shared by all of them. I do want to note that the hexagonal lattice is one that frequently trips people up. The hexagonal lattice is actually 3 parallel pipettes that are repeated around a central axis. So even though if you were to look at a real crystal, the atoms would appear to be oriented in hexagonal symmetry, basically, so that they had rotational symmetry. It only takes the description of a single parallel pipette, 1/3 of those atoms, to be able to replicate the whole crystal structure. So even though the hexagonal crystals are a different shape than all the other crystals in macro space, we can still talk about parallel pipettes. So what we want is to construct a function that can uniquely identify cubes from the set of parallel pipettes. It needs to be dependent on only what we call the lattice parameters, which are the side lengths and the internal angles, and not on the order in which they're input. We would also like to be able to compare shapes of different sizes that are the same shape. We'd like this function to be equal to some number. Here we've chosen 0 just because it was simple, if and only if the shape is a cube. That way we don't have any false positives. And we would like this function to follow some kind of obvious trend as we're varying one lattice parameter, one side length or one angle. Obviously, when multiple things are varying at the same time, it's going to be a lot more complicated. And in some ways, that's the problem we're trying to solve. But we want to have at least one simple test case. The function that we came up with is based on the face diagonals of the shapes in the parallelepiped. It's not the body diagonal, which would be from one corner to the opposite corner in the 3D shape. It is from corner to corner in an individual face. And the reason for that is because the body diagonals are actually not unique between cubes and parallelepipeds, but the face diagonals can be. And that is because in a cube and only in a cube, every single face is a square. In any other kind of parallelepiped, at least one shape, one face, is a parallelogram that is not a square. And squares always have a body diagonal that is equal to their side length times the square root of 2. So we're basically going to compare the ratio of some side length to a body diagonal to the ideal ratio of 1 over square root of 2. I want to note that technically we should look at all 6 faces of our parallelepiped, but because these come in opposite parallel sets that are congruent, basically, so faces at the top and the bottom are the same, we only have to look at 3 of them, but we do still have 6 total terms in our metric because each parallelogram has has 2 different side lengths for one diagonal. So it's basically, as I mentioned, the ratio of a side length to the body diagonal minus the ideal ratio inside of absolute values, so that both a positive deviation and a negative deviation both count as you've moved further away from a cube. We have a normalization condition we divide by 3, which fixes this from varying between 0 and 3 to instead 0 and 1. But the normalization condition is not absolutely critical, and so I won't go into it too much. I do want to mention one tiny little hiccup, though, which is that the function, as I've shown it here, actually diverges at really low angles. This example here, I've set all of the side lengths the same, A, B, and C, and I've set the internal angles the same as well, and I'm just plotting as a function of that internal angle. And you can see that when it's less than 90 degrees, it goes up very rapidly. But crystallographically, there is no difference between 89 degrees and 91 degrees, because if there's a 91 degree angle in one parallelogram, on the opposite side of it, the complementary angle will be 89, right? So you could always redefine the origin of your crystallographic unit cell such that you're now talking about the larger number. So it cannot be an asymmetric function. We need to address this issue. There are 2 ways to do that. We could either require that crystallographers always deal with angles that are larger than 90 degrees, but we figured that would have relatively low compliance. So instead, we've written the function piecewise, which achieves this symmetry, but means that you don't have to convert your data going in. So the result looks like this. This is for a singular face. When it's greater than 90 degrees, the angle, leave it alone, but otherwise either subtract or add 180 degrees. Both will work because of the periodicity of cosine. We do the same for each individual face and then have our normalization condition. And this is a symmetrical function, which works both ways for any angle that you put in. So having discussed what our metric is, we then also wanted in our paper to talk about things that should motivate people basically to want to use this. And so we have 4 case studies. The goals of these are as follows. Firstly, we want to talk about interpreting phase transitions. And then we would like to compare to something called a tolerance factor, which I'll speak more about later, but it's something that gets used a lot in our field. We also wanted to try to use our cubic deviation metric, or CDM, to interpret structure-driven properties. And then finally, we'd like to inform the synthesis of new materials with our tool. So jumping in with the first one, pseudobrookites are a materials family that was studied previously by our postdoc Davor. They're all related to a mineral called brookite. They're all orthorhombic, and that's how they're similar to this mineral. And they're notable for a couple of reasons, one of which is that they have these open channels along the C-axis. This can make them interesting for battery applications because you can put things into those channels. They also have really interesting anisotropic lattice expansion properties, which can be very important. And if you've got magnetic atoms, they can also have interesting magnetic properties. So this is an example of an aluminum titanium oxide pseudobrookite that Davor studied. And this one goes through 3 different phase transitions as the temperature is increased before it finally decomposes into aluminum oxide and titanium oxide. In the conventional way of discussing this kind of lattice expansion and phase change, we would look at 2 different plots to interpret what's going on. These would be the differences in the lattice parameters. So here we're going and subtracting the initial value of the side lengths from whatever they currently are, and then dividing by that difference to get a percent change. And you can watch how each individual lattice parameter changes. And then on the right-hand plot, this is just a plot of what the angles are in this system. So it starts out as orthorhombic and everything is 90 degrees, but then it'll go through phase transition such that 90 degrees is no longer the best angle to describe the unit cell. There's a couple of other hiccups here, which are something that you're used to dealing with if you're a material scientist, one of which is that the convention of which side of the unit cell is which changes when you go from one space group to the other. Specifically, the A and B definition changes, but I want to emphasize that if you were watching a specific atom that lay along the A axis of your original unit cell and it was going through a phase transition, it wouldn't teleport over to the other side. It would stay in one place. It's just the definition of our origin that has changed. So there is no crystallographic difference between these two, and that's why they're plotted in one line here. But if you were trying to compare to someone else's data and they had selected a different origin choice, it may look as though...
Sorry, can I have a question?
Sure.
I mean, on these diagrams, you have a lot of points. Are they really experimentally existing structures? You have observed that by changing the temperature, how?
Yes, so high temperature powder X-ray was done on each of these points. So the change of the unit cell was experimentally confirmed and refined, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I'll continue. So this crystallographic redefinition is not critical. And so one of the things that our CDM accomplishes is it takes into account that swap. It's agnostic to the choice of origin. And so we no longer have to deal with that confusion. It also does a really great job of showing the lattice expansion of how we're moving further and further and further away from a cubic lattice as we continue, which can be a little bit obscured by the fact that, for example, if you were just following this B parameter, it actually doesn't go up continuously, it goes down and up. And yet we still see discontinuous transitions at the phase transitions. So we have an indicator that a phase transition is occurring. And as Davor mentioned, these are all experimental points. If we had a denser series of points up here, we might even be able to see a better discontinuous transition at the higher temperature phase transition as well. This also takes into account both the A and the B plot at the same time. So this is kind of just a nice example of how the CDM can simplify discussions that would otherwise be a little bit complicated.
Shannon, as a follow-up question after Moise, could you clarify, do you have the same material, but then you vary the temperature and measure the structure? So they were set so different temperatures, but essentially for the same material sample.
Yes, so to the best of my knowledge, this is done on the same sample. We have in various different labs setups that can heat a material and take in situ X-ray diffraction patterns while it is at that temperature. So this would be the same sample that was undergoing a continuous phase transition, if I'm correct, Davor.
Yes, so at this certain temperature, there is even appearance, there is a shift in peaks and appearance of some new peaks after the phase transition, meaning they cannot be explained anymore with orthorhombic, this CMCM structure. So you do need to use monoclinic structure to fit the data after the transition. But it's the same sample continuously heated, and X-ray is taken at every temperature that we stabilized our sample.
And to use powder X-ray diffraction to determine the structure every time.
Yes, yes. And then, of course, doing a read field refinement on each of these collected data sets.
Okay, thank you.
I would encourage you to take a look at this paper, Davor's paper, because it actually has the X-ray patterns and you can see them change over time. Well, this is kind of an example where we're looking at temperature as the changing function, and it's a relatively simple case, but I think the CDM becomes very interesting when we instead talk about comparing one materials family to another, because this is an even more complicated problem. So these are the same types of plots that you saw in the last one. This is the same material, the aluminum titanium oxide, but here we're not changing temperature. We're adding additional titanium into the structure and watching what phase transitions result from that. In the top, this is the conventional representation where the individual parameters are plotted separately. And then the bottom is our cubic deviation metric picture. And what really is interesting here is when you compare to a similar material that has the same space groups, but it has a different atom here, iron titanium oxide. And you can see when they're plotted on the same set of axes, as opposed to when the lattice parameter deviations are plotted separately, they actually follow very similar behavior on their way to this final C2/M beta phase. There's a couple of interesting things here, which is again that we're still reproducing the discontinuities in the phase transitions, but also that there is a wider region of stability of this lambda phase in the aluminum compound when compared to the iron compound, which again can be a little bit obscured when you're just looking at the lattice parameter deviations here, because they're going up and down at the same time, as opposed to looking at a single function that goes down continuously. So I think in the case of the pseudobrookites, this across materials comparison is something that was difficult to do before, and is something that we're hoping that the CDM can help with more in other parts of our field.
Shannon, this apparent discontinuity of the CDM at about 2.9 when X in the in this picture, how does it correspond to the continuous graph that was shown earlier?
So the lattice parameters do change discontinuously here. So the continuous transition means that we're looking at the phase changing as we're adding more titanium here, but it is a discontinuous phase transition in that the lattice parameters change abruptly. Sometimes phase transitions are very subtle. For example, if you have something that was orthorhombic and the 90 degrees changes to 90.1 degrees, it can no longer be defined as orthorhombic. And so we would call that a continuous phase transition because there hasn't been an abrupt jump. But occasionally the atoms will reach a different configuration such that the lowest energy configuration is now very, very different from the starting one. And that's basically what's happening here. So a roughly orthorhombic structure for a long time was preferred by these atoms, but once there is sufficient titanium added into this structure, there's now a lower energy configuration where the lattice parameters are significantly different from their starting point. And that's why we have this jump here in the CDM.
So you mean that atoms are simply located differently?
Yeah, but I mean, but they're not speaking about atoms. It's only lattice parameters here.
This is true, that we are speaking about the lattice parameters, but the reason that they have changed is because there is now a lower energy configuration for the atoms. Or you can think of it as the packing of the atoms, because we're basically stuffing more titanium atoms into this unit cell. Once we have enough titanium atoms here, they're no longer wanting to configure themselves in an orthorhombic or nearly orthorhombic structure. They have to be very monoclinic in order to minimize the empty space in the unit cell.
Excuse me, on the diagrams you have something alpha, beta, so I wonder what is the meaning of these. You have C2/M alpha, then you have C2/M beta, so they're different phases, so you distinguish, or what is the meaning of these?
Yes, so they are the same space group, but they do have there is a big reorientation of atoms, and there are two different phases. So very often in material science you will see different phases in the same space groups. Here, what's important to mention is that this, especially around 2.9, let's in the first example of aluminum and titanium oxide, that CDM helps us to see this discontinuity much better. But to understand the discontinuity, we would still need to go to material and understand why this is happening. And here, the big importance is appearance of this titanium magnetic dimers, which causes this big. At certain point, the concentration of these dimers becomes critical, and there is a phase transition to this beta phase. So CDM allows us to see what's actually happening, or at which point there is some critical change. But of course, to understand why is it happening, we need to go more deeply into material. But that's kind of the point, to be able to analyze the whole families of material and find these discontinuities, which then can be further analyzed.
Thank you.
But yes, just to reiterate, the lambda and beta phase are the whole space group is the same, but position of the atoms changes significantly. That's why.
So I'm really a bit confused, because in fact we are given data of lattice parameters, but at the same time you're speaking about position of atoms. So what are you considering finally?
We are
In
considering,
in the CDM specifically, we're only considering the lattice parameters, but the structures are truly different. So we're talking about two ones that have this rough structure, but there is different degrees of distortion specifically in the coordination polyhedra, specifically in the bonding environments. The overall lattice parameters go through a very discontinuous and large change, which is how we know that the atoms have undergone a reconfiguration. But in order to interpret why that happens and its implications for the material's properties, you would go back and look at the specific structures, which both look roughly like this because they're both the same space group, but they have different amounts of distortion in the individual bonding environments of the individual atoms.
Yeah, thank you.
Happy to answer more questions about this. Otherwise, I'll keep going.
Shannon and Davor, I guess you have C files for all these intermediate structures somewhere, maybe in
Yes.
supplementary materials of your paper, right?
yes,
Yes.
For the aluminum titanium composition change, it was taken from the paper which are cited on the next slide. So
Okay.
but yes, we do have all the parameters in the supplementary files. One thing to mention is also in the second example, very often when you're looking at the large families of material, there are multiple sources which can vary by a lot of things, the way they are refined, the time of when they were discovered, which can change the lattice parameter themselves, but CDM does allow you to better combine them into a single graph or single data set. But yes, the main couple of points from the left files are from my paper, newly synthesized materials. However, the higher titanium content is from the paper which was cited in our article. And here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, if there are no more questions on this case study, I'll speak about the other ones. I mentioned earlier that we wanted to set up our cubic deviation metric in contrast to what's called a tolerance factor. Structural tolerance factors are used, and I would argue abused a lot in our field. They're basically empirical metrics that are designed to predict whether a combination of atoms will crystallize in a particular space group before you have made them. And as such, they take as inputs only the atomic radii of the components of that structure and their proposed packing arrangement. The most famous one is the Goldschmidt tolerance factor, which was made in 1926, and that's this guy right here. It was specifically for use with perovskites, which always have the same bonding arrangement like this. And it's basically a measure of thinking about how the spheres of a fixed radius can pack into the unit cell and minimize the amount of empty space. So you're trying to figure out what the ideal value of this metric is in order to create a perovskite. This has been used extensively in the literature for perovskites, and it does a reasonably good job at predicting whether a combination of atoms will be a perovskite. And it's also been tweaked a little bit to make it more effective and applied in other situations for other kinds of bonding environments. In other words, for other structures besides what's called a perovskite. So we wanted to emphasize to others in our field specifically that the cubic deviation metric is not a tolerance factor. It's not designed or even able to be applied before you've made the material, because you have to have a measure of the lattice parameters, which you won't know until you've actually made the material and performed diffraction, or if you're doing a computational study, until you've already refined and optimized the position of atoms in a theoretical unit cell. So in order to test this out, we also wanted to look at a little bit more complicated example, which my other co-author, Greg, has a lot of experience with. He was looking at this quaternary, in other words, 4 atom material series. It's got 2 of an A site cation, 4 lanthanides, 2 to the N coppers, and 7 plus NQ, we've called them, which are either a sulfur or a selenide, depending on the materials family. And he explored a lot of different substitutional variants of this compound. They crystallize into 3 different structures that have different bonding arrangements. So 2 of them have the same space group, i.e. the same overall unit cell shape. They're both orthorhombic. This is the n=1 variant, n being the values here in this equation, and the n=3 variant. And then the n=2 variant is actually a monoclinic structure where there's a change in the angles. So this is the quaternary tolerance factor, QTF, based on the radii and approximate packing of these 3 structures that Greg's group developed. And when you apply it to materials, it looks like this. So on the bottom axis here, we have the radius of the lanthanide, and we have tried different substitutions of that lanthanide. So here we have large radius on the left and small radius on the right. The value of this QTF is vertically here. And as you can see, the QTF successfully sorts these into a region of high QTF value, which corresponds to large lanthanide radius, where the materials will crystallize in the n=1 space group. Then as you lower the lanthanide radius, you reach a region of mixed phase stability where the materials can crystallize in any of the 3, moving until finally you reach the very small lanthanides. They will crystallize preferentially in the n=3 space group. And I should mention, these are all room temperature data points that if you'd like to take a deeper look at, you can see here in this paper. Greg's group really did synthesize all of these and measure their X-ray diffraction patterns in order to determine their exact space groups. The reason that the QTF is able to predict this transition is because tolerance factors and the QTF specifically are talking about the bonding arrangements. They're talking about how the atoms with a fixed radius are packing specifically tightly together. And the transition going from high lanthanide radius here onwards is a smooth sort of transition where we have the addition of a new copper selenide or copper sulfide group around the bonding environment of the A site cation as we move from the n=1 to the n=2, and then finally an additional copper selenide or sulfide group as we move into the n=3. So the mixed phased region here is where any of these bonding environments are favorable, but on either end, when the lanthanides are very large, the copper selenide will either only be added, which is this case, or it will not add into the structure in this particular location here for the low lanthanides. So the quaternary tolerance factor, which is detailed a lot in this paper, does a really good job of sorting this way, and it's talking just about bonding environments. So if we're not talking about bonding environments and instead we're looking at the unit cell as a whole and talking about its shape, that is what the cubic deviation metric ought to do. And this is what it looks like when we apply the QTF. Same axis down here, although it's inverted the other direction, where we have the lanthanides on the bottom, and then our value on the y-axis is the cubic deviation metric. And what you'll see here is that we're, instead of having a long, smooth relationship between these, we instead have grouping and clustering. And the really interesting thing to look at from this perspective is that I'll remind you the n=1 and n=3 homologies have the same space group. They're both orthorhombic. And yet, the cubic deviation metric tells us that the 2 and the 3 homologies are actually more similar to each other than they are to the n=1. And the reason for this comes when you look at their unit cell shapes. The n=1 and 3 are both orthorhombic, but the n=1 is kind of narrow in this one direction, in the C direction. It's much more narrow compared to the n=3 structure, which has a more widened c-axis. And then when you move to the n=2 structure, you have that same width of the c-axis, but now you have a little bit of a cant in the the angle here. It's no longer 90 degrees. So this is something that can help you. It's like an additional supplementary way of analysis. Instead of talking about the bonding environments, which is what a tolerance factor often is used for, instead we're talking about the unit cell shape. And qualitatively, the unit cell shapes of this top one, which is monoclinic, and the n=3, which is orthorhombic, are actually more similar, which is a little bit counterintuitive and probably not something that someone in our field would naively expect. So this is a new result that we're pretty excited about. Questions on this case study?
I'm really a bit confused, and probably you'll help me, but I mean, we can choose very different unit cells. So all your studies depend on the way you choose the unit cell. And that, for example, I can have a Wigner-Seitz construction. And then, I mean, there you'll be completely lost. So, I mean, my question is, to what extent it depends on these? So to say, you have followed the crystallographic convention or the international tables convention of choosing the unit cell. But if I choose another unit cell, what will happen?
This is actually something I'm going to mention more in the next case study, but it does definitely depend on your unit cell choice. And I think in some ways that is the problem that we're trying to address. In our field, a lot, people will talk about a specific unit cell, and then they'll talk about a transition from that unit cell to another one, as though they've gone through a really big change. But in the case of say, from this structure to this structure, the angles could have changed in a very small way. We could have gone from 90 degrees here and 91 degrees, and then you can no longer have an orthorhombic unit cell. And so in that case, there can be this plurality of choices where you can have two very, very similar unit cells that are nevertheless part of different categories. They're different lattice systems, right? So in some ways, what we're trying to do is to say that when you go from one unit cell to another, it is not always true that you have made a very large change to your material, like the material itself. And in the cases where materials can be described by more than one unit cell, the CDM usually comes out to a very, very similar value, which is a good indicator that there was this true plurality of choice, because the unit cell is a way of describing real arrangements of crystals. And if the real arrangement of crystals has not changed a large amount, we would like the unit cell to also not change a large amount. And so the CDM is trying to quantify the amount of change, and it could potentially also be used to help people choose between unit cells if there's a reason why one description might be easier to interpret than another. But you are absolutely correct that this is all about the choice of unit cell that you make, and that there are frequently multiple choices, and there are often cases where there's no one choice that's obviously better than the others.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And just to build off of that point, I think one of the benefits of the CDM is that independent of which, assuming that you're fitting crystallographic data and you have the choice between a few different unit cells and space groups, like Shannon was saying, they're all going to be such minor differences depending on how you refine and fit the data. But importantly, the CDM value should be about the same for all of them. So in some sense, it's a way to unify the essence of the unit cell shape without the details of which space group you picked.
Yeah,
Are there other?
Yeah, we were discussing.
I don't quite agree, because in fact your CDM is defined over that specific unit cell choice. And if I have a different unit cell choice, then your function will be completely different.
This is true, but I'll go back to the function. If the angles here are very, very close, because we've constructed a symmetrical one here, if you're talking about a unit cell that's not orthorhombic, that says has 92 degrees as its alpha value, for example, the value is very, very close to a unit cell which has the 90 degrees as the alpha value. And in this particular example here in this graph, I've also set the side lengths the same, but you can also make a graph like this where you're just looking at how the side lengths change the value. And again, it is not a diverging function, which means that a small change of your lattice parameters makes a small change in the CDM. So even if you chose a unit cell that's nearly orthorhombic but is not orthorhombic, you'll still end up with a very close value.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you.
Shannon, yeah, as a follow-up, let me give a slightly more complicated example. If you show a slide with any cubic crystal, so imagine we double this cube, so it becomes twice larger in only one direction. Okay, in the direction of vector A, for example. So it's no longer a cube, it's a rectangular box, but we only doubled the unit cell. So of course, it's not primitive, it can be reduced to the smaller one, but now imagine we slightly perturb atoms in this doubled cell. And similarly, of course, the periodic translations under the new basis 2A, B, and C, right? Then after this perturbation, this doubled cell becomes primitive, so minimal by volume, right? So so it changes now dramatically, although the material itself is almost the same.
Yes. In that case, if the unit cell itself, what we have defined as this imaginary box, if that has changed dramatically, the CDM value will change dramatically. And it's definitely an open question when we're talking about supercells or when we're talking about some kind of perturbation that now means you can no longer reduce the cell or that you can now reduce the cell. How to handle those specific situations are something that we're still looking at. Well, the problem that this addresses is a very beginner problem, which is trying to relate all of the Bravais lattices onto a continuum and to remove the concept that an orthorhombic and a monoclinic cell must, by definition, be very far apart from each other and be very dissimilar. When in fact, if it's a very, very small difference in the individual lattice parameters, they may be similar. It's this similarity question that we're trying to answer, but it is very much true that you should be looking carefully at the actual atomic positions if you are saying that cells are different or similar, because the unit cell is just a descriptor of the real space atoms. It does not necessarily tell you how the real space atoms have changed.
Okay, thank you, Shannon.
Get back to where we were. So as I mentioned, we took a look a little bit at different unit cell choices, and then this example will get some into that. We wanted to take a look at a material where there's an obvious structure and property correlation, and piezoelectric materials are a pretty obvious use case for that. Piezoelectrics, if you're unfamiliar, are materials which change volume when they experience an electric field. Conversely, if you stretch or compress them, they will produce an electric current. So they have a lot of different applications in the real world. The piezoelectric modulus, which is D33, it's just the term that people use for it. It's a part of a matrix, quantifies this volume change under applied electric field. So it's the number that people frequently talk about when they're saying that they're trying to make a better piezoelectric. They're trying to optimize this value. One of the most well-studied families of piezoelectrics crystallizes in the Wurtzite crystal structure, which is a hexagonal. When you're just looking at a singular parallel pipette, the actual hexagonal structure will have some rotational symmetry that looks more like the real material. In the Wurtzite families, the volume change of a piezoelectric is driven by cation and anion separation that lies along the C-axis, which is the long axis here. And I'll remind you that in a hexagonal crystal structure, the A and B's are the same. Theory and experimental results on Wurtzite specifically have found that if you plot the C to A ratio, you can end up with a correlation with the D33 value. And that's what this plot shows you. So there are 3 different families here, all in the Wurtzite crystal structure, the hexagonal crystal structure. And you can see that the scandium gallium nitride family right here is in purple and has a different maximum value of piezoelectric modulus than the scandium aluminum nitride family. But in both cases, a decreasing C to A lattice parameter, meaning that the long axis here is becoming shorter, indicates a higher value of the piezoelectric modulus. So in these families, they've been studied a lot, and over time, people have been finding ways to reduce that C to A lattice parameter in various different ways, including like thin film strain, basically, in order to try to reach higher piezoelectric modulus values. So we were curious what the cubic deviation metric would do when we applied it to this situation, because as the C to A lattice parameter ratio decreases, you're basically coming up with a quote unquote more cubic unit cell because the side lengths are becoming more similar. It never becomes cubic because it is still hexagonal, but it does become quote unquote more cubic. And so this is something that someone in our field would call a pseudo-cubic transition. And the CDM does in fact replicate this trend. The clustering is a little bit different, but we still see that the different materials families come out in different ways, and that an increasing amount of cubicness leads to a higher piezoelectric modulus. So this is a replication of results. And then we wanted to talk about, with this example, what happens if you choose a different unit cell. So there is another way that you can describe hexagonal materials. It's called the D cell. Nobody uses it anymore, I should say. It's not really a great way of looking at these unit cells because it doesn't give you an intuitive understanding of where the bonding is. And you can kind of see that here in this example. But it is a rhombohedral cell, meaning that the side lengths are the same. So if you were to use this example and switch to a different unit cell choice, then you could not talk about the C to A lattice ratio because A, they're no longer oriented in the same direction. And so they're no longer oriented along the direction of the cation anion separation that's important, but also the C and the A lattice parameters are the same in this unit cell. So if you apply the CDM with this redefinition, you actually can reproduce the grouping, although the trend goes in a different direction. And the interesting thing here is this would imply that a higher or further away from a cube shape gives you a better piezoelectric modulus. But I would take a close look at this line here, which is really nearly vertical and suggests more that we may be approaching some kind of ideal non-cubic structure, which will produce the highest piezoelectric modulus, and not that you could extend the original trend infinitely to zero until eventually your hexagonal structure compresses so that the C and the A are exactly the same value. So that's an interesting thing to note. This is our first test case where we're really trying to choose different unit cells, and I will fully admit that this is not an intelligent choice. I would not recommend that anyone looks at the D cell here at these hexagonal materials. However, it is a test case, and it's something that we're definitely looking into more. If you have choices of unit cells for describing your true structure of your atoms, how does the CDM change? That's something that we're hoping to look at more. There's one other thing I'll say here, which is now that we can apply to different unit cell choices, we did want to test this on a database of materials. However, there isn't really a good database of piezoelectrics. We applied to the materials project database, which is all calculated piezoelectric moduli, so it's not experimentally anchored. And there are a lot of errors in that database, missing decimal places, incorrect space group assignments, things like that. So we do not see any kind of trend in this data, but if we had a higher quality database, I would be interested in exploring that because it's not clear whether there's no trend here because it's only the Wurtzite crystal structure that has this special relationship with the shape of low quality data to test with. So a higher quality database is something that we're definitely interested in. And in my last case study, I'll talk about materials interpretation where we do have, in fact, a high quality database. Any questions on this section before I move on? Okay. For our last case study, we wanted to talk about superconductors, specifically the cuprates. They're really, really well-studied superconductors. And in the cuprates, we have, not we specifically, but the whole field as a whole has found that there are two important factors that you can tune that will help to control the superconducting transition temperature, which is the temperature to which you must cool your material before its resistance drops to 0 and it becomes a superconductor. And those two factors are copper oxide planes, which I've denoted here with these diamond-shaped blue lines, and the spacing between them in your unit cell. There are many different classes of superconductors in the cuprate family. They have different numbers of these planes in different locations, different spacing atoms in between them, and they all have different transition temperatures. But even knowing that the presence of a copper oxide plane can be important, it's still difficult to predict what the superconducting transition temperature will be. We call this TC. And one of the common ways that people try to do this is they try to plot some factor that they know to be important along with the transition temperature. In this case, they've plotted the spacing of the copper and the oxide in the copper oxide planes. And when you do this, you end up with these three quote unquote domes. In the different domes, different physics, people try to work within a particular dome or family of superconductor, a particular type of crystal structure that has a particular type of physics. And they try to optimize the superconducting transition temperature as a function of whatever particular parameter is important in that dome. And so we were curious of how the cubic deviation metric could come into this, because a lot of this has to do with the specific bonding approach. And that has been very well studied and explored in the superconducting materials family. But there's somewhat less of a question or less of a focus, I'll put it, around the unit cell shape. These materials are actually not all the same unit cell shape, even though they look very similar. Some of them are orthorhombic, some of them are tetragonal, but they're very nearly orthorhombic. So we were curious if that could have an effect, and that's where the CDM comes into play. And this is what it looks like when we plot a really high quality superconducting materials database, which is you can find out information about at this paper. I want to note that there are these vertical streaks because some materials families have been explored at different doping levels and by different people, and they've resulted in different superconducting transition temperatures. The really famous families are marked here vertically, and you can see that it comes out into two separate regions, with a region where there are no superconductors known in the middle here. Now, we in our group also synthesized some new candidate materials, the samarium, barium, copper, boron oxide, which ought to have been a good candidate because it has the important bonding that has already been noticed. This bonding indicates that copper oxide planes are present and they're spaced well, such that this should have been a great choice for a superconductor. And I also want to note that we tested a lot of different similar substitutional variations, including a lot of different dopes. When we plot it on this plot, it seems to suggest that it exists in a region where the shape of the unit cell does not allow for superconduction. But why that happens, we have no idea. It's very much an open question, and it's not something that someone has looked at before. So in contrast to the conventional bonding picture, this would suggest that the actual shape of the unit cell, in other words, the macroscopic arrangement of atoms, may also have an influence on superconductivity. And it's something that we're looking into right now. With the Johns Hopkins applied candidates that have the required bonding environment. And then we're planning to kind of filter and try to explore this region out here, which is a little bit underexplored historically. See if we can find ones that have a particular shape of the unit cell that people haven't looked at before and explore more about this relationship, hopefully helping us to understand how the macroscopic arrangement of atoms can influence some previously studied only from the perspective of bond. So that is all of our case studies. In conclusion, our tool is volume normal, a big step forward for the field, because a lot of comparing were difficult to apply between materials families when you perform substitutional doping, things of that nature. It is applicable to all the 7 systems and hopefully helps to set them up in relation to each other. It specifically is designed to be a quantitative descriptor that you use alongside words like pseudocubic. It's best suited for post-synthetic analysis, but we're hopeful that it can inform materials design. And as I've already mentioned, we're still exploring more niche use cases of this. One of the big ones that we want to think about are mixed phase systems where you have a solid solution, an arrangement of atoms that's best described by 2 unit cells at the same time. We're also curious about the idea of supercells and what happens when you perturb the description of the unit cell, but the atoms haven't really changed their actual physical locations, as well as a more rigorous mathematical investigation of the limits of our tool. If you'd like to read more about our work, our paper in progress is linked here. You can test some code that we've written in Python and various other languages at the center one. And then we have a comparison chart with similar tools, including ones which explore polyhedral shape, as well as the famous strain method that's on the Bilbao crystallographic server, which works for comparing one lattice to another, but it is not volume normalized. And so you can't use it to compare very, very radically different lattices or line them all up on a number line. So if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Please thank Shannon for the presentation, please. Physically here or virtually. I'll first stop the recording and then invite